who is Yossi Israeli, a postdoc fellow at the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters at Ben Gurion University. He received his PhD from Tel Aviv University, writing his dissertation on the theological and exegetical works of the converted Bishop of Burgos, Pablo de Santa Maria. Just recently published a chapter under the title Christianized Sephardic Critique of Rashi's Peshat in Pablo de Santa Maria's Additiones ad Postilam Nicoli de Lira in the volume on medieval exegesis and religious difference, edited by Ryan. Yossi Israeli. The lecture is... Never mind, I'll read. Here, early converso reflections on the biblical kingship. Was God's people destined to be ruled by a king and nobility?
As you probably see, the nobility part fell because of issues of time. I would like to thank first of all to the organizers of this conference, and especially to Professor Stoczynski, who invited me to speak. I would also like to apologize before all of you, because I will unfortunately not be able to stay after this session, and so my sincere apologies. Okay. The dominant presence of conversos in the ranks of the royal administrators, who produced along the 15th century a new political, historiographical, and providential discourse of monarchy, has long been acknowledged, and their distinct contribution to its development is the subject of an ongoing study. The earliest formulator of these letrados theories, as one historian called him, was Pablo de Santa Maria, the celebrated rabbi Solomon Halevi, who converted in 1391 and soon after became a pivotal figure in the court of Castile, a prominent churchman, and eventually also the Bishop of Burgos. His contribution to the development of the historiographical and political discourse in the peninsula was mostly accounted to his royal chronicles that were written in support of his patron, King Juan II of Castile. These works shifted, maybe for the first time, the historical focus from classical myths to the biblical events, and adopted early Spanish history to Old Testament chronologies, reflecting, as historians noted, the unique biblical sensitivities of the converted bishop. In today's talk, I would like to take the opportunity and turn our attention from these chronicles to Pablo de Santa Maria's actual biblical scholarship that bear, I believe, another testimony to the new kind of ideas and tendencies that conversos introduced to political thinking and that had long-standing implications. Now, it is important to remember that for the vast audience of Christian scholars of the 15th and 16th centuries in the peninsula and beyond, Pablo was known first of all as an outstanding biblical scholar who composed in the 1420s a massive bulk of additions to the biblical commentaries of Nicolas de Lyra, the Postila Literalis. By that time, the Postila was the most popular and authoritative literal commentary to the Bible in the Christian world, and the fact that Pablo's additions became regularly appended to Lyra's commentaries in the second half of the 15th century has won them phenomenal circulation in both manuscripts and printed editions. But the reason that the Additiones became so alluring in the first place was that it presented a staggering and acute critique of Lyra, and thus often of Christian biblical traditions in general. Pablo's commentaries focused on issues relating to biblical hermeneutics and Hebraic scholarship, often with the intent of stressing the continuity between Judaism and Christianity, and generally did not address political concerns. But at least on one occasion, his structural critique of Christian scholarship touched on a crucial question in the history of biblical political thought. Was the chosen people of God destined to be ruled by a mortal king? In order to understand what exactly was Pablo's contribution to this subject, we first have to say a few words on the prevailing Christian traditions at this time. Unlike their early modern successors, who have often treated biblical polity as a model or as a point of reference for their own political ideas and aspirations in what sometimes today is called political Hebraism, medieval thinkers usually did not ponder on political realities of the Old Testament, and let alone applied them systematically in their deliberation of political ideas. And thus, although rhetorical allusions to biblical kings, and especially to King David, were never rare in monarchic discourse, The two scriptural proofs that were regularly used in order to support the divine consent of kingship were passages from the New Testament that had nothing to do with the historical kingship of the Israelites, and in fact had nothing to do with kingship at all. Evidently, this disconnect reflected the basic hermeneutic disposition of Christian scholars toward the histories of the Old Testament, as something that in its literal sense bared only little relevancy to believers living in the Christian age of grace. Just as the law of Moses, or at least its ceremonial and judicial aspects, lost its literal significance under the law of Christ, so did the laws regarding kingship seemed obsolete. And just as the stories of the fathers were shadows of the gospel, so did the positive representations of kingship in Israel were mostly endorsed as prefigurations of Christ. However, in the case of kingship, there was another much more concrete reason that rendered the biblical past meaningless, or almost meaningless, to Christian present. Medieval thinkers that endorsed monarchy almost unanimously believed that the Old Testament itself was not favorable to the idea that Israel was to be ruled by a mortal king. Indeed, everyone knew that God instructed Israel already in Deuteronomy 17 how to elect their king, and even provided several regulations of how a king should behave. Namely, that he should avoid from accumulating too much wealth and women, observe the law, fear God, and respect his subjects. But on the other hand, the story of how the first king in Israel eventually came to power casted serious doubts about God's intentions with regard to kingship. In the first book of Samuel, chapter 8, it is told that after Samuel's sons took bribes and perverted justice, the elders of Israel gathered together and said to the prophet, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint us for us then a king to judge us like other nations." And as the Bible tells us, Samuel resented this request, describing it as wickedness. And God himself said in response to Israel's petition that they have rejected me from being a king over them. Yet despite of this deep discontent, God instructed Samuel to follow Israel's request, and after warning them that their king would treat them as slaves, Saul was crowned as the first king of Israel. Now, Christian scholars have traditionally understood these passages as a proof that the constitution of a mortal king over Israel was an act against the rule of God, and thus a high theological and hermeneutical barrier was raised between the political theories and realities of the Christian kingdoms and those of ancient Israel. Even the intellectual revolution that transformed political thought in the late 13th century did not reverse this general tendency, as we can learn from Joseph Canning's History of Medieval Political Thought. Canning deals in length with the impact of the new juristic and philosophical Aristotelian languages, but almost never mentions biblical scholarship as part of this process. And indeed, it appears that while the new Aristotelian science proved that monarchy was the best kind of governance, the political thinkers of the time were still very cautious not to draw direct parallels to biblical kingship. In the Summa Theologia, Thomas Aquinas contended that the model of monarchy was best presented in the Bible not by the actual kings of Israel, but by the governance of Moses and the 70 elders who ruled like a king with aristocracy to his side. In his political treatise, De Regno, kingship, the institution of biblical kingship played even a lesser role and was portrayed as part of the process that led to the political destruction of the Jews. Now that's true also to the most popular work of this time of Guys of Rome, though lesser true to Aquinas' disciple Bartholomew de Luca, that already gives more space to biblical kingship in his models. In order to illustrate how deeply rooted was this anti-political approach in Christian biblical scholarship and how it pushed back against attempts to link political theories to biblical Israel, let us turn to the Christian champion of the literal sense, Nicholas de Lyra. In face of the new scientific evidence that monarchy is the best polity, Lyra asked again why then Israel sinned when it petitioned for a king. And this is how we answered the question. I'm reading. It should be said that since kingship is the best polity, When nations other than Israel asked or constituted upon themselves a king, they did not sin, but rather pursued a great good. However, when the people of Israel did so, they have sinned, as we learn from the words of Samuel in chapter 12. You shall know and see that demanding a king for yourself, you have done a great wickedness in the sight of the Lord. The reason is that God elected Israel to be his own special people before any of the other nations. As said in Deuteronomy, the Lord your God has chosen you out of all the nations on earth to be his people. Therefore, God was to be the immediate king of this people, and for that purpose he himself gave them the law at Mount Sinai through an angel who spoke in his person, and not through a human mediator. Accordingly, God wanted that the human governors of his people will be chosen by him directly as his vicars rather than as kings or lords, as evident from the cases of Moses, Joshua, and the following judges. On this account, the people of Israel have acted against the will of the Lord when they asked to crown upon themselves a human king, after God reserved this role for himself for the good of the people. And therefore their request was not for the sake of the good, but for the sake of the bad. Thus, falling in line with past biblical traditions that contended that biblical kingship was a sin, Lira was by no means willing to accept that the political theories of his time were of any relevancy to biblical Israel, and vice versa. There was, as Lira explained, a fundamental break between Christian political realities and those of the Old Testament, since biblical Israel were under a particular spiritual and historical condition, unlike any other Christian nation. But how could this explanation be settled with the laws of kingship that God did give to Israel in the book of Deuteronomy? Lira came up with the following solution. That's the last segment in the slide. The rules given in Deuteronomy 17 regarding the constitution of a king were not a permission in the proper sense, but rather a major remission, just like the divorce of a wife was a remission on account of the hardness of their hearts. In the same manner, the divorce was a precept, in the meaning that one had to give a letter of divorce if he nullified marriage. Israel were giving instructions on kingship for the case that in their stubbornness they would ask for a king. Thus, if there was any doubt, biblical laws of kingship did not represent, according to Lira, the best political ideas, but regulated a fundamentally sinful situation. Or, as Lira put it in another commentary, they were not precepts at all, and not even simple concession, but rather a remission regulating a bad thing. The comparison to the law of divorce, which Christian agreed had no moral, civil, or theological validity, and which often represented the corruption of Israel, stressed just how fundamental was the break between the politics of biblical Israel and that of the Christian norms. Now, this was exactly the kind of fundamental division between the literal sense of the Old Testament and Christian ideas or norms that Pablo wanted to bridge in his biblical commentaries. And while usually the issues at stake regarded theological value of the Old Testament, in this case it was the political heritage of Israel. As Pablo states right in the opening of his commentary, Lira's treatment of the issue was flawed and insufficient, since it was founded on the basic false presumption that a mortal king stands in some contradiction to the direct governance of God. After all, Pablo claimed, the Christians are by no means governed by God less directly than the biblical people of Israel were. For just as the people of Israel were proclaimed to be God's chosen people, so did Peter said in his first letter with regard to the followers of Jesus, "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people." Likewise, while Israel was given the law by an angel of God, Christians were given the law directly by the eternal Son of God and the Holy Spirit. Thus, if it is right to say that Israel was to be governed by God directly, it is even all the more true with regard to the Christians, whom are governed directly by God through his vicar, the Pope. Accordingly, Pablo continued, if there was any truth to the words of Lira that Israel sinned for asking a king, then it would be also a sin for Christians to do the same, since a king will stand as an obstacle in God's perfect rule over his believers. Yes, in the case, unlike in the case of Lyra, in the case of Pablo, I'm not reading what the text. I'm just paraphrasing it in a more fluent way, I hope. Yes, no, yeah. Thus, from the very outset, Pablo targeted the fundamental theological and historical division that categorically and to his mind artificially separated the political realities, ideals, and norms of the Old Testament from those of his Christian world. There was nothing inherently different in the regulation of politics, faith, and the rule of God in the time of ancient Israel and in the time of the church. The political history of the Old Testament was on the same theological and hermeneutical level as the politics of the Christian world. The implication of these assumptions to the relevancy and status of biblical laws regarding kingship were clear. For if there was no categorical distinction between divine politics in the Old Testament and in the age of the church, then clearly the same biblical rules and examples could be relevant to Christians. Therefore, it was also important for Pablo to reject Lyra's comparison between the biblical regulation of kingship and the regulations of divorce. Yes. The laws of divorce, Pablo explained, were a permission to break the institution of marriage that was a part of the natural law. But kingship was itself derived from the principles of the natural law, as Aristotle and Aquinas showed. Thus, there was no comparison between the two, and Lyra was wrong again to describe the rules of Deuteronomy 17 as a remission regulating a bad thing, for it was a precept given as a simple concession with conditions. But if the institution of kingship was founded on a precept that was a simple divine concession, as Pablo argued, what was so outrageous in Israel's petition for a king that infuriated Samuel and brought God to claim that Israel wished to replace him? The answer that Pablo gave depended again on the complete entanglement between political and biblical ideas. Israel did not sin because it asked for a king, but rather because they petitioned for a certain kind of kingship that was against the divine law and against political reason. As Aquinas explained in the Footsteps of Aristotle, there were two different kinds of kings. The first kind was the king with the complete potency over his people. His authority was not restricted only to warfare, protection of the kingdom, or the arrangement of the governance, but it included also all judicial matters to the degree that he was not constrained at all by the law. This kind of kingship depended solely on the personal virtues of the king, and since high personal virtues are very difficult to retain for a long time, it tended to deteriorate to tyranny, which is the worst kind of governance. A second kind of king had limited powers, and he was subjected to existing laws and legal norms that regarded any matter pertaining to justice, and especially commutative justice, it was the obligation of the king to enforce these laws and amend them when they were flawed, but he could never exceed them. To Pablo's mind, this was the kind of kingship that was permitted to Israel by the laws of Deuteronomy 17. As he explained in more detail than we can follow here, the biblical commands prescribed a monarchy with limited powers that was subjected to the law. The rules given in Deuteronomy ensured that the king will not become tyrant, and in this sense, the law of the Torah subjected the king not only to the divine law, but also to the proper political norms, which, according to Pablo, seemed to be one and the same. But Israel evidently didn't want to follow these laws. When they petitioned Samuel for a king, they said specifically, "Appoint for us a king to judge us like other nations." And the nations, so Pablo proclaimed, were not governed by kings like the one prescribed in the Bible, but rather by kings with absolute power that often became tyrants. In other words, Israel sinned not because its subordination to the law excluded it from the common political norms, but because the old law already embodied perfect political ideals that were not followed by the other ancient nations that Israel wished to imitate. And thus, the Christian exegetical tradition was turned on its head. The biblical ideal of kingship was the model to follow in contemporary reflection on monarchy, and not an obsolete example of Israel's defiance of God. Now, in order to support his unconventional positions, Pablo implied that he was following Aquinas, and that's a tactic that he often used in order to disguise some of his a part of the boldness of his ideas. And there is indeed no doubt that in certain aspects he actually did. But as many of you have probably noticed by now, more than themistic principles, Pablo's ideas resembled, as was often the case, the Jewish exegetical traditions of the time. In complete contrast to Christians, the vast majority of Jewish scholars believed, following Talmudic teachings, that Israel was destined to establish a monarchy in the Promised Land, and that the regulation of Deuteronomy 17 were a positive precept, mitzvat aseh, for the institution of this kingship. Accordingly, they were almost unanimous in their basic understanding that Israel's demand for a king in Samuel 8 was not a sin in itself, but that it was the manner in which they asked for a king that was sinful. Moreover, as historians showed, the intense Jewish halachic preoccupation with the legal status of kingship in Israel, Dinah de Malchuta, took an interesting turn among Sephardic and Provençal scholars of the late Middle Ages, who injected into these deliberations a strong comparative motif between the biblical histories and the political realities and theories that developed in their Christian surroundings. We should remember that unlike their Christian contemporaries, these Jewish scholars, who were generally not less sympathetic towards the ideal of monarchy, lacked any scholarly framework to ponder on political theories other than halachic or exegetical literature. Thus, for them, the analogies between political theories of kingship and the kingdom of Israel were almost unavoidable. Pablo knew these Jewish traditions intimately, like no other Christian scholar at the time, and it seems that he was particularly influenced by the famous sermons of Rabbi Nissim of Gerona, in whom circles of pupils he was educated. Thus, it would be most befitting maybe to describe Pablo's position on biblical kingship and its institution as a unique mixture of these rabbinic traditions with themistic scholarship. And in this sense, Pablo sets a remarkable example of how converso thought was shaped by its Jewish biblical heritage, as Americo Castro argued vigorously. Now, Pablo was indeed a very unique scholar, even among converts. But due to the phenomenal circulation of his works, his innovations to Christian biblical scholarship did not go unnoticed. Denis de Carthusian, one of the greatest compilers of the 15th century, quoted segments of Pablo's Additione in both his commentaries to Deuteronomy and Samuel. After comparing them to other Christian opinions, he concluded in wonder that on some respects they stood against the opinions of Augustine, the Clausa Ordinaria, and all other familiar commentaries, and that in other respects they contradicted the opinions of Lyra, Aquinas, and all Catholic doctors. In the Iberian context, Pablo's ideas were translated most significantly through the biblical commentaries of Alonso de Madrigal, El Tostado, the Bishop of Avia, and surely one of the most important and influential Iberian scholars of the 15th century. El Tostado repeated in full and even expanded the exegetical confrontation between Lyra and Pablo, eventually adopting Pablo's position, though without mentioning his name. But maybe the most intriguing evidence testifying on the influence and the impact of Pablo's ideas on biblical kingship and their Judeo-Christian liminality is to be found in the writing of Yitzhak Abravanel. Abravanel's gloomy experience at royal court, that I'm sure we'll hear more about next, made him a persistent critique of the moral validity and political efficiency of monarchy. In order to support his unusual political views, Abravanel argued that even the kingship of biblical Israel was a misdeed that subverted the rule of God, a position that went against all Jewish traditions and complied with almost all Christian opinions. And we should say almost, since, as Abravanel noted, there was one exception, that he found among, quote, the wise men of the new Christians and the old, the opinion of Don Pablo, the Bishop of Burgos, which Abravanel described and refuted in great detail, together with the opinions of the Talmud, Nachmanides, Rabbi Nissim, and Rabbi Nissim of Gerona. Thus, in the context of biblical scholarship, we can safely say that the ideas of the converted bishop had substantial impact, both in the peninsula and beyond. And in this sense, it did not appeal exclusively to converso audience. Hence, the wider question that still remains is to what degree and how exactly such notions of direct continuity between biblical and Christian political ideals characterized converso attitudes of later generations. While I don't presume to have an answer, I will conclude by pointing that these notions strongly resonated also in pro-converso apologetical works that were written after 1449, and especially in the Defensorium Unitatis Christianae of Alonso de Cartagena, Pablo's son. In face of the growing demand to discriminate converts, these converso protagonists stressed that the Jewish biblical origins of conversos placed them at the heart of the mystical body of the church, and surely did not impair their spiritual status as Christian. As Claude Stuczynski argued, very convincingly, if I may add, these ideas resembled in their hermeneutical tendency the work of Pablo de Santa Maria, with the important difference that now political and civil questions took the center of the stage. And indeed, we can find that for Alonso de Cartagena, political continuity between the Old Testament and the Christian world was of crucial importance, as it supported one of his main arguments that civil nobility could transfer directly from biblical times to Jewish converts. The problem that Alonso tackled as he tried to establish his claim were very similar to the one that his fathers addressed. Apparently, since the Jews were the only people who lived under the servitude of the old law, as the apostles and the church repeatedly said, there was a doubt if they enjoyed the civil virtues that regularly came with kingship and political sovereignty. For that reason, it was instrumental for Cartagena to stress that the Jewish servitude referred only to the divine law and its theological applications, but that biblical polity, with its kings and nobility, operated under the same Aristotelian principles that were derived from the natural law, and that applied to all nations, pagans, Jews, and Christians. And so, what we may see here is an example of how ideas that once originated from the singular Jewish cultural heritage of converso scholars of the first generation were now sustained and, of course, to a certain degree transformed by the political and social crisis that their descendants faced.